the end of the Herbert Cello Concerto, it's a series of just bananas notes, that don't lie well on the instrument, and also crazy, string crossings and just weird patterns. And when I first sat down to learn it, it was like, oh, okay, all right, I can't. There's too many things. I got to separate it.
It's great to be on the line with my good friend, Lauren Pierce. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and Lauren holds she's coming up on the record for most frequent podcast guest. I've chatted with Lauren many times over the years about all kinds of things, but most recently, the courses that she's been making for Discover Double Bass. And I'm just a big fan of what she does. We've got links in the show notes to everything that she's up to, so be sure to check that out. And we're talking today about her latest course, Practiceology. Deep dive into practicing, hows and whys and tools and techniques and all that kind of good stuff. So I really hope you enjoy this episode. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Robertson and Sons, D'Addario Strings, A440, and Upton Bass. Thank you so much, guys, and you'll be hearing more from them later. But let's dive into this conversation with Lauren Pierce, all about Practiceology. I got way too much to talk about with you. So I go through and I take a bunch of notes and I put a little red mark by what I think would be interesting. And I've got like 5 pages of notes with a lot of red marks. So,
well, let's get started. We might finish before the World Cup is over, you know?
And so I'll also link up to that Why Practicing is Frustrating article, which I think is super interesting. Cool. And Thanks. A good sort of and maybe actually we could start by talking about there were 3 things you talked about in that. Practicing needs patience, persistence, and curiosity, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Talk about those 3 elements of practicing. Why do? Oh, and actually, was this also in the article? Was this on the site? Actually, I think maybe we could even start with this. You wrote practicing is a process and a skill, and not an instinctual one. And yes, I agree so much with that.
Yeah.
Talk about that. Why is that? Why do you think that's so?
Well, I think all of us relate to that, just sentence, I mean, anyone who has ever tried to practice, that is, assuming everyone that's listening to this or has been on any website that has to do with music or creating whatsoever, we've all tried to practice. And I think the way that we learn certain skills is very different than others, and practicing is a skill that we have to learn. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine where I was running that part of it by him when I was writing the article. And he said, well, I don't know if I would consider practicing a skill. And so we got in a conversation about it. And eventually we both sort of with a bunch of back and forth, we came to this conclusion that it is and also isn't a skill. So it's a skill in that you have to learn how to do it, but it's also something that you do to learn another skill.
Right.
It's just a sort of crazy thing. And I kind of like to think about practicing as a substitution for the word learning. That's what we're doing. We're sort of applied learning. And the reason why I don't think practicing is necessarily instinctual is because there's so many different elements. And when you're learning something like math, or you're learning something that, is by no means easier, but you have these sort of equations and facts or whatever that make it almost like a step-by-step process in and of itself. And you still need teachers to help you. But with music, there's so many different variables. And, we're often taught how not to practice, or we're told how not to practice. So don't run through an entire piece. Don't do this and do that. But we aren't really taught why that's not a good reason. And if we are, then we aren't really given many concrete substitutes. And, one of the things that was always told to me was that you shouldn't practice, with rote or repetition, which that is now the basis of my practice method. And of course it doesn't work for everybody. Different instruments, I think, practice differently, ever so slightly. But, I had this idea that I shouldn't practice that way. And then out of frustration, I think I started doing it in a certain way and found that it worked very well. And so that's a really long-winded answer to your question of why it's not instinctual, but it's just not very obvious. It's not necessarily based in common sense.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I've heard practicing described as being two parts. There's the problem solving phase, and then there's the repetition phase. And people get caught up in thinking that they're practicing, which really what they're doing is problem solving. And then they get to the point to say, "Aha, I've got it." But in reality, you got it once, and you've got to now you got to develop and you so eloquently lay this out. You put out a video, and I'll make sure to link up to that too, just about warming up in general. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? What is warming up to you, and how do you structure that, and what do you cover?
Well, warming up, I think, is something that none of us want to do, which is understandable because, we're crunched for time most of the time. And even if we aren't, it's sort of one of those things that we're like, I'll warm up as I practice, But I found that when I was starting to get into fitness and, doing a lot of longer exercise routines, it's so easy to think, I'll just skip the stretches. It's fine. And that's a whole other argument in the entire fitness community that I won't even touch. But I remember one coach saying to me, the warm up is what allows you to perform better during the actual workout. And I think that's absolutely true for practicing. Just getting your fingers warmed up. Even I will, just often underestimate how valuable that is, just getting your body ready to go. And it's also a time for me to get mentally prepared. So what I start with is slow scale, and I do the same kind of format, which I link to in the video. And I also provide a transcription of that so you can actually see it. And that usually takes about 10 minutes. And then I'll do something like involving shifting. The shifting drill or the vomit drill is great for just warming up my fingers and my ears. And with the slow scale, I also practice with a drone, and that's another ear exercise. And then I'll sort of slowly transition to something that involves a little bit of velocity or, left hand facility. And sometimes that's something like the 4-note progressive scale or the shiftless scales and thumb position, something getting my fingers moving. But oftentimes what I'll do is I'll take a tricky spot in my music. When I was learning the Handel Halverson or, Chardas or the Herbert, literally anything that has something, fast and tricky, which is to say everything, I would take oftentimes, that little spot that's really giving me trouble and put that, at the warm up. And what that might look like, in terms of practicing it in the warm up versus practicing it later is I might incorporate a little bit more slow tempos at the beginning. I might, add a drone or practice with a MIDI file with piano accompaniment, whatever, just to kind of get myself in the swing of things and gradually transition to the routine.
And how long is this warm-up phase for you typically? Is it 15 minutes, 30 minutes? What do you have a range for yourself?
Usually I aim for about 20, 25 minutes. My slow scale takes about 10, and I try to overestimate the time that each thing takes because I am fantastic at underestimating how long things take. So this is like, it takes 10 minutes if I'm also like texting at the same time,
Right.
But usually it's like 8-ish minutes. And then the shifting drill is maybe, 3 or 4 or whatever. And then, because it's sort of a clouded time when I transition into the normal routine, if I'm incorporating the tricky spots from my music, then it can be, anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes 25 if I'm practicing a lot. But if I have a short amount of time to practice, then I'll also pare down my warm up, and I can make the slow scale 5 minutes. I can do just one quick shifting drill. There are ways to make it shorter, and I make sure that I have different warm ups of different lengths for that reason.
Whenever anybody's going to the Midwest, and I lived in Chicago, Illinois for years and years, I tell them to go to A440. If they're looking for a bow, if they're looking for a bass, if they need some repairs, then if they have a student who's looking for an instrument, A440 has been serving the community for years and years. They're located just west of Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago. They do great work, and they've been a big supporter of bass events over the years, whether it's the Chicago Bass Festival or really any bass event. A440, you guys rock. Check them out at a440violinshop.com.
I'm Jory Herman, and I'm one of the newest members of the Los Angeles Philharmonic double bass section. Last year I began using the Diodario Kaplan strings and really love how they sound and what they can do. As a young bassist, my first memories of playing the instrument were actually on the Diodario Helicore strings, so you could say that I've been using Diodario products since about 1994. Throughout college and my early professional life, I tried many different types and gauges of strings, and even experimented with mixing and matching from different sets. I would put 3 strings from one set with the lowest string from another, or maybe just change out the top string or do half and half, but never was really fully committed to the entire set from a single brand. Kaplan strings, however, do everything that you need them to. They have a crisp articulation while remaining warm and resonant from top to bottom across all strings. They have an immediate and clear response without maxing out in the loudest section of the music, all while still being delicate and singing in the softest sections of the music. All around, they're an incredible set of strings for the orchestra bass section.
You also talk about, in one of your lessons, about setting up a definite plan. And I love that. I've gone through various phases myself where I just grab my bass and I start banging through things like a maniac. And it says where I'm much more intentional about how I'm going to plan and what do you recommend? How much is enough? How much is too much in terms of actually creating a definite plan?
Well, I think that, I could end up eating my words here, but I don't think you can do too much. The reason that I started making a plan was because I found that I was much more productive if I wrote my plan down. Even if I had a general idea of what I was going to do, if I wrote it down, then I had it on paper and I had very little decision making to do. I am pretty terrible at making decisions quickly. It takes me a while, and then I go back and forth, and then I think, oh, well, maybe that's not the right thing. And that's just not what you want to be doing when you're practicing. And I don't think I'm alone in this, talking to like literally any other human. I don't think I'm alone. And so in terms of detail, I used to include a lot more, but now that I sort of know, well, this is how I practice this kind of thing, I just need to make a little note of, my tempos. But if you haven't quite found, what works best for you, then be as detailed as possible. It's not going to be a bad thing. The only thing that I would say is, don't do it if it's too time consuming. Figure out shorthand, or, is there maybe you can plan for the next day by writing certain things down and then record a voice memo of your thoughts on the day's practice, something like that, because if it's too complicated, if it is even a little bit too complicated for me, I won't do it.
Yeah, I hear you. I remember going into what I now realize was way too much detail. And I think I spent 20 to 30 minutes writing out my plan. And then I only had like 20 minutes left to practice.
Right.
So that's finding that balance is great.
Totally.
And you also dig into intentional practice. And there's some great concepts I like to dig into here. But what is intentional practice to you? What does that mean?
Well, I got the idea of intentional practice from meditation, so mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness has been a word that's sort of been a buzzword, kind of going through all different areas in our world, but I think it's a really useful one. And I think, what I was talking about earlier about people recommending or telling you not to just run through pieces without thinking, that I think is a good example of the opposite of intentional practice. And I have a lot of issues with maintaining focus. That's always been an issue of mine. And that's why I do things like meditate and, long distance running and things like that. But with practicing, it's so easy for all of us to just get, our minds get tired or we get distracted by things. And so intentional practice is essentially, the first step to making, you're practicing effective, and when you are focused and you are intentional, then you're making conscious decisions for, okay, this was out of tune. This is what I'm going to do to fix it in the next 2 minutes.
a line that you have. You're practicing too fast. A memoir by every teacher ever, I think. And how many times I have said that not only to students but to myself.
Right.
I don't even know how. So, how do you address that? How do we slow ourselves down? Why should we slow ourselves down? Why is slow practice helpful?
Right. Well, that is a conversation that I have a lot with my students. And I think with every single student that I have, I mostly teach adults, and a lot of them are beginners. A lot of them are also, they've been playing for a while, maybe for several years, but classical music is new to them, and maybe they haven't been practicing the best way or whatever. So, after a certain number of lessons, there's always this lesson where we have a sort of come to Jesus talk, right? Mm-hmm. And they'll say something along the lines of, Lauren, I just feel like I'm getting worse. And I'm like, all right, put your bass down. Let's hold hands. Let's have this talk, because that's such a frustrating place to be in. And I know that. And usually what it is that they aren't practicing in the best way possible. And that's because we maybe haven't talked about it yet, or I haven't gone into as much detail because we've been focusing on other things. It's usually within the first 3 or 4 lessons. And a big part of that is talking about slow practice. And when I tell people practice slowly, and then they go and do it, or if we don't even talk about it and I ask, usually they'll start way too fast for their, baseline slow tempo. And that's a conversation I've had so many times, because people just don't even realize that that's how slow you need to go, which is fair. Another, time where it's just not as instinctual as I think a lot of us musicians can take for granted. And so there was one student in particular who I love. He's one of my favorite students I've ever had. And every week for a while, he was practicing the Bach bérets from the Third Suite. And I was telling him, start at half tempo at the very highest, and then do tempo levels of 10, maybe even 5 if it's a tricky spot, and work your way up to the gold tempo. And he would look at me blankly, and I would think, he's not going to do that. And he wouldn't. And so week to week, I would ask him, how did you practice? And he would do, maybe like 75% tempo and do 3 different repetitions. And that's just not enough. And so that's where that came from, just really forcing yourself to go as slow as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's something that's such a valuable lesson for people to learn. I remember chatting with Andy Ricidi, who's the bass professor at Northwestern, and I think he picked that up probably from many people, but specifically Paul Ellison, about how the body and the brain doesn't really register time like you might think it does, and slowing things down to really think through every move and see every piece. You can sort of that spending that time in that meditative kind of slow mode, you find that moving it faster, it's not nearly the challenge that you might think, because you're solving those problems, and they're just not solvable at those fast tempos. Okay, that's beautiful. You've got these practicing these general techniques and the things that you cover in warming up and that sort of thing. And there are a couple, and everybody should check this out. There's a link to the course and pick it up. It's the cost of a lesson, so it's a no-brainer. Definitely get Lauren's course. But just a couple that caught my eye that I just want to learn about. You wrote under intonation. You have 4 strategies. One of them, I think number 3, is the technical exercises to bludgeon your will strategy. What on earth is that?
Yeah, isn't that great? That's actually Dennis Whitaker's doing. So when I was planning this course, I knew I wanted to talk about general techniques, for practicing things, that are just big topics, intonation, velocity, all of that. And then also name some specific practice techniques for, in your music or whatever. And so when I got to the topic of intonation, I think that was maybe even the first one, I sat down and I thought, oh my gosh, how do I even begin with this? And I had this whole existential crisis, and then called Dennis and said, hey, how do you work with your students? Because I'd seen him teach before, and I really liked the way that he approached, just pretty much anything. I liked how he addressed his students. I liked how he worked with his students. He's very patient and very creative. And so I didn't call him. Now that I think about it, I sent him a Facebook message. That must have just been the most ridiculous message to get. I must have just been at the end of my rope of sanity. But anyway, he sent me this long, very eloquently written response that talked about these actually it was 5 strategies that he included. And I thought, like, this is something that could have been written for like Strad magazine or something. It was just so perfect. And I called him and I said, I'm just going to shamelessly use this. I will credit you, but I'm just like, it's perfect the way it is. And I love those titles. The technical exercises to bludgeon your will is my favorite. So.
Well, and it's great to hear those are from Dennis. Shout out to Dennis. He's just a fabulous bassist and teacher. And so you also have the glowing tone strategy, which I may have an idea of what that is, but knowing that this comes from Dennis. But can you talk about what glowing tones? What does that mean?
Yeah. And, actually, I first learned about this from Kate Jones. She's, my best friend, and she had shown me a lot of the stuff that I talk about in the course, actually, just, over the years. I've learned so much from her. And glowing tones were one of the things that we had talked about. And I don't know if she had used that term, but essentially, those are the resonant notes on the instrument that just make your instrument resonate. They make them sing. So if you play, say, in first position on the E string, you put down second finger on G, then if you're playing in tune with your instrument, then the top G string should start to vibrate. You should be able to see it. And you should also be able to hear some of the other overtones. And there's more than just that second finger G. There are several of these. And in that lesson, that's essentially what Dennis was talking about. And using those tones for intonation help, just training your ear by using just your instrument and also just the way that it feels.
You also, we won't go through all of these because I know Lauren has other things to do, but something that you talk about under bow control is perfecting the start. That's one of the strategies. You mentioned perfecting the start. What does that mean? Why is that a strategy?
Well, because I think that I found for myself, when I start a note, if I don't start it right, we all have experienced this where we get a squeak, or it's not exactly at the right dynamic just yet, or we get this sort of like tail at the beginning, then it affects the shape of the whole note, and even if you get that squeak because you haven't been able to grab the string and get the full tone out of it, you can fix that, later in the note or even immediately after. But I think the entire note shape is really important, and that's what we're kind of going for, So a good, healthy, long tone should look, like a long rectangle with a clear beginning and end to it and a consistent tone all the way through. And getting that start is not always easy. So if you're going with a down bow at just like mezzo forte on an open string, then, pretty easy. But as soon as we get into like double forte, starting in an up bow, on one of the lower strings, that's when we get into trouble. But there's so many times we have to do that. And so practicing individually is really helpful and something that I did when I was working on this.
You've got I love practice methods. I love trying to come up with some sort of systemized way of doing something that can be very non-systemized. And in your course, you've got 8 of them. You've talked about one, which is slow practice. You also have, and again, check out the course. There's a link in the show notes so you can get more detail and hear Lauren talk in depth about this. But you have slow practice, 3 times perfect, practicing with rhythms, up 10, down 5, add a note, dividing and isolating, phrase by phrase, and mental practice. So those are 8 fabulous practice methods. We've talked about slow practice, maybe just briefly, 3 times perfect. Talk about that practice method.
So 3 times perfect is based off of the slow practice method. Essentially, slow practice, the way that I do it is, let's say you've got a piece where the goal tempo is at 100. Divide that in half, you've got 50. That's your start tempo. Depending on how comfortable you feel going between 50 to let's say 60, then it might be that that's too high. It might be that you need to go by 5 for each tempo level. But let's say it's 10 for each tempo level, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And the idea is that every single day you start at that half tempo, or if it needs to be slower, that's fine too. Just whatever can, allow you to play it as perfectly as possible and think about everything so comfortably as well. Then you play each one of those tempo levels and focus on everything, and you gradually get faster. 3 times perfect is that same idea, but you add the extra level of having to play at each tempo level 3 times in a row perfectly. So that means everything, intonation, all of the right notes, all of the right fingers, the bow in the right spot, the dynamics. If you're going for memorization, then that's another good thing to add in there. And the idea is that if you can do it 3 times in a row perfectly, then you're probably good, and you can move up to the next tempo level to 60. And then if you can do that again at 3 times perfectly, then you're probably good. And if you aren't, it will show up somewhere. So the most frustrating thing in the world, and I think this happened actually in that lesson in the recording, was you play it 3 times in a row perfectly, except the very last 2 notes of the 3rd rep, you make a mistake. And then if that happens, you got to start all over again and go for 3 times in a row. And so if you aren't as comfortable as you think, then it will show up, and then it gives you an opportunity to go back and try again.
I like that number. 3 times is a reasonable amount. 20 times, that's that's a recipe for pain and injury and who knows. Once it's easily could be a fluke.
Enough. Yeah, right,
it's like missing the free throw 5 times and you make it once. What are the odds? So I like that number 3. And you've also got practicing with rhythms, and you and I both studied with Jeff Braditich. I remember working with Jeff, and he had 7 rhythms that he would go through, and I think they were like da 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 da. I can't remember the ba ba da ba da.
So many.
But are those the rhythms you cover, or how do practicing with rhythms work for you?
Yeah, I take them from his book.
Okay.
So he's got 7, and I've got 4 that I generally cycle through. And for me, those are just my 4 favorites. And I could do all 7, but truthfully, I think 4 is a good number for me. Those are the ones that I know I can apply very quickly. And it kind of doesn't matter what the rhythms are, just changing the rhythm so that it is different from each, different variation is enough. You're spacing the notes out differently. So you've got a tricky shift that's now really close together, so you have to move your hand a lot faster, or you've got an awkward finger pattern that's a little bit more spaced apart. So you have time to think about it. That's really what that's about.
Yeah, it's fascinating how giving yourself space and then compressing the motion, how and just changing that frame, what that does. I've wondered for years why that works as well as it does, but it's like making a passage into a puzzle, and by solving the puzzle, you're cement. I think Ed Barker, principal bass of the Boston Symphony, talks about that sort of practices. You're making a groove in a ball of clay, and every time you practice a new rhythm, you deepen and widen that groove.
Oh, I love that.
Which I love that. Yeah.
And, I think I don't know if this is necessarily related, but I think it is. So I do these cardio workouts by this girl who I really love on YouTube. She's got a ton of different workouts. And one of the things I really like about them is that they're very new, and it's a hit workout. So there's a lot of different stuff going on. And if I've done her workouts before, they're still hard, and I push myself and get sweaty and whatever. But if I'm doing a brand new workout, she's got different levels. So if I'm used to doing level 4 or whatever, even if this new workout is level 2, the mere fact that I just don't understand the choreography yet is enough to make it that I'm drenched in sweat by halfway through. And I don't know what that is. This is total just bro science right here. But I think just that added confusion is, my heart rate is going crazy because my body is just wait, this way, okay, and I think it's kind of similar in this way. I had a friend in college that used to practice certain lines backwards, which is a total mind melter for me.
Yes.
I tried it once, I think, and I was like, this is more work than what it's worth. But, I think it's the same kind of concept.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. Yeah, the practicing backwards thing, I find very challenging unless you're talking about like a 3-note thing with a shift, and then I find that helpful, kind of like taking a record and moving it back and forth. But yeah, I always it boggles me at people that can do that. That's
yeah.
Up 10, down 5, another method referring to the metronome, I'm assuming.
Yes. So that's another one that's based on the slow practice method. And then you just add a little bit of intensity. So using that same example, if the goal tempo is at 100, then start at 50, right? And assuming that you're going, each tempo level is by 5 actually is how it would work. But you can, change the numbers. It doesn't have to be that. Right. But let's just say by 5, right? So you're going 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, so on and so forth. Sometimes just doing that slow practice, or even 3 times perfect, just isn't enough purely for the movement in your fingers. Like, do you ever feel that where you're trying to get faster and it's like your fingers are just going through molasses?
Yes, definitely.
We all have that. And I don't know what that is. It's just something I think with that whole, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Fingers that don't want to go faster just kind of stay slower, And so this method was actually taught to me by the oboe professor at USC, and it works wonders. I mean, the first time I used it, I was like, oh my God. So what you do is you start at 50, play the line 3 times. You don't necessarily have to aim for perfection for this one, but if you're starting at your first baseline tempo and you aren't able to play very comfortably, then you should lower the tempo a little bit, right? But you don't have to get it absolutely perfect necessarily as you get faster. So you've got 3 times at 50 and then bump the tempo up to 60. And remember, you normally would be going up by 5 to 55. So this is quite a bit. And that's what's called your quote unquote jolt tempo. And that's supposed to just scare the living daylights out of your fingers and going, oh my God. And then they move really fast, and then you lower the tempo back down. You play that once, lower the tempo back down to 55, do 3 times in a row again, bump the tempo up to 65, your fingers freak out, and then you lower it down. And you do that sort of like, zigzag sort of increase of the tempo until you get to the goal tempo. It's a little time consuming, but I find it works wonders if you're just really struggling to push the tempo faster.
This episode is brought to you by Robertson and Sons Violins. For more than 40 years, over 4 decades, Robertson and Sons has specialized in providing the highest quality stringed instruments and bows to collectors, professional musicians, music educators, and students of all ages. Their modern facility, which is totally beautiful, by the way, if you're ever able to make it out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, I highly recommend it. They have a recital hall that they use not only for performances, but it's available to their clients. So if you want to try out a fine pedigree bass or even a student bass or anything in between, you can go in that recital hall. I've had the chance to do that. Totally amazing. I'm like a kid in the candy store when I'm down there at Robertson's. Check them out online at robertsonsviolins.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Upton Bass. And have you checked out this new travel bass from Upton? Oh my goodness, what a cool looking design. What a great sounding bass. It's just totally remarkable. And the way that they're launching this product, it's just so perfectly Upton. It's bold, it's innovative. You got to check out these videos of Gary Upton unfolding, I don't even know how you describe it, putting together, I guess, this travel bass. It takes almost no time. It is in a Samsonite piece of luggage. I kid you not. It is just a suitcase. It is literally a suitcase bass, but it comes together and it's a real bass. It's a nice sounding bass. It's so cool. Just another example of the way in which Upton is innovating and blazing new trails for the bass community. So thank you for what you do, Upton, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Yeah, it's kind of like interval training for practicing,
exactly.
Right? Yeah, I watch people in the gym on the treadmill and they're going real fast and then they go back down and right,
yeah.
Cool. I've never done that. I've got some tricky. I got this Harry Potter concert coming up with all this bonkers stuff. I think I'll give that a whirl. Yeah.
Harry Potter of all pieces.
Well, yeah. What can I say? We do these full movie accompaniments, and the bassists get 1/100th of what the violins get. There's still a lot of crazy stuff that you got to sit down and take the time, no matter who you are. So I will try that. Add a note is another method. So do you start with one note, go to two, go to three? Is that how that works for you?
About there, yeah. Most of my practice methods are very structured, and you start this way and then you do this and that. And add a note is structured, but it can be fairly open-ended as to how you start and progress. So the example that I use in the lesson is the Bottesini. It's, I think, measure 48 or whatever, where there's these two lines that are slurred forever, and they're basically parallel lines, but a difference of a whole step between each one. They're really tricky in the left hand, very fast. And that was the method that I used to learn those lines. So I can handle the first three notes of the first one, which is open D, first finger E, fourth finger F sharp. I believe that's what the line starts with. Mm-hmm. So I start there. I don't necessarily put a metronome on, but you can. That's fine as well. You just want to get those notes, and then you add one note. And then when you feel comfortable with that set of notes, then you add another one. And it's sort of just, there's no structure, so you just have to really be paying attention to how am I feeling, how am I sounding, can I add another note right now? I'm probably good to add another two, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit less structured. And so the idea is that you do that to learn the line, and then you use one of the practice methods like slow practice, 3 times perfect, that kind of thing. Okay. Cool. And then divide and isolate. Dividing and isolating. Yeah.
How does that method work?
So that's for spots in your music that have two big things going on, which is, it's kind of funny to say it out loud now because it's kind of like everything that we play. But, big things like double stops, a series of double stops, or I talk about in the video the end of the Herbert Cello Concerto, where it's a series of just bananas notes, that don't lie well on the instrument, and also crazy bowing string crossings and just weird patterns. And when I first sat down to learn it, it was like, oh, okay, all right, I can't. There's too many things. I got to separate it. And so what I did was I separated the left hand and the bow. I practiced just the bowing string crossings with essentially, I was in thumb position, so I used the octave harmonics of each string that I was playing on and just played, the note on the respective string that it would be on in the pattern. And dividing it that way was really helpful because even if I didn't memorize the exact pattern, that wasn't the point. It was just to get more comfortable with those awkward patterns. And then I added the left hand in there. And I didn't do this time, but you could just add, sort of miming. You don't have to play with the bow necessarily, or if you feel more comfortable with pits, you can do that. So the other area that I talk about in the lesson is practicing double stops, and specifically the octaves from the Grand Tango by Piazzolla. The last, 3 minutes it feels like in the piece is just a series of octaves, which is just terrible. And so, whether it's octaves or if it's double stops or whatever, I like to separate the top note from the bottom note when I'm practicing. This also applies to false harmonics too. Just anything that has two different things going on. There is a way to divide it, and it just makes it a little bit easier to manage when you're first learning it and when you're fine-tuning it.
Phrase by phrase is another method you've got. And how does that work for you? Is that talk about that?
So a lot of these methods are great for faster pieces, but if you're practicing something slow, like the example I use in the course is vocalese, that's already slow. We don't need to make it any slower in order to, get it. You might need to for, a couple notes, but basically this was more geared towards not only slower pieces, but also just the idea of phrasing. So you can use it for fast pieces as well. And what I do there is I divide it into it depends on how long the phrases are. Now that I think about it, if the phrase is like 8 measures or something, then I might divide it in half or whatever. But generally, I divide it into each little phrase. And this is where I do things, like I talk about mental imaging a little bit earlier in the course, where you hear what you want to actually play, and then you play, and then you sort of analyze, okay, well, what did it sound like? Sometimes you need to record yourself. I've done that a lot. Just to be able to listen back and hear, because what you play isn't always, what you think you played. And so you do that for each individual phrase, and then just kind of build on each other. So I'll do the first one, get that how I want it, and then the second one, do the same thing, and then I might combine them. So this isn't necessarily for things like intonation or anything technical, although it can be. It's more for phrasing, where you kind of just need to decide what you're doing and sort of get your bearings physically on how that feels.
Well, I love these methods. And then the last one that you outline in the course is something that I've also thought a lot about, and I'm sure many people have, is mental practice. So mental practice, do you do that on a daily basis? Do you do that every once in a while? How does mental practice work for you?
Well, I like to do it. I mean, I should do it more than I do. I mean, it's like everything in my life. Actually.
Me too.
It's like the physical practice, I think, is just the more concrete one. And that's the one I have an easier time planning, of course. And I talk about this in the course, but I don't plan my mental practice. If I do it, I'll do it while I'm going for a walk, maybe. Or I used to do it while I was driving, and then I thought maybe, like I'm not focusing on one of the two things enough, so I'm not going to do that. But, I'll also just kind of like sit in my apartment and let myself be quiet and do it then if I have some time and space to do that. But I think it's part of visualization, which is a really key aspect of learning. I heard this thing from a friend of mine who read about how your brain, runs through things. So have you ever had trouble falling asleep at night? And it's like, as soon as you lay down, your brain is like, hey, you busy? You want to think about this thing that you did like 10 years ago that was really stressful and embarrassing? Let's do that right now. Is this a good time? Your brain does that because it's sort of like, I'm totally going to butcher this. I hope nobody that actually has a medical degree is listening, but your brain does that basically to sort of run through the moves so that the next time a stressful situation happens, you understand what the choreography is and you avoid that. And that's such a valuable thing for us as musicians, because especially with bass, our instrument is so large. And so I think mental practice is both about the physical part of it as well as the phrasing and emotional side of it. And so it's a written lesson, and in that lesson I talk about how, I try not to really put too much structure or pressure on myself. I just like to do it because anything is so incredibly helpful. But you can, if you find that you want to and you find that helps you.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got all these methods, and they're so helpful and laid out. And again, it's the cost of a lesson, folks. So you pick it up and you get Lauren going through in even more specific detail, and you can go back and you get worksheets and you get all sorts of materials to make this stuff concrete. The last part of the course is just so important. It's about becoming your own teacher. And it's something I was actually just thinking about this today. I was listening to a podcast with Don Green, who's a performance coach. He's worked with Olympic athletes and then moved into the music world several years ago. And he speaks a lot about how in the Olympics, for example, you are working with a coach almost 100% of the time for your training. Every single move, you're getting feedback. We as musicians will get a lesson a week, if we're lucky, that 1 hour. And then we have all these other hours, 10, 20, whatever hours a week by ourselves. So becoming our own teacher and learning how to analyze our own playing and our tendencies and what we are doing that we shouldn't be, and vice versa, which you go into, is just so valuable. So I'm so glad you included that. And I really do love, I think what you wrote is things you should be doing but probably aren't. And then you have things you think are helpful but aren't. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely did not take this from my own personal experience. It's totally other people. I've never done anything that
of course,
that I thought was helpful. I do everything that I should be doing. No, but in reality, a lot of what you do as practicers, when you're learning how to practice, is just kind of experimenting and sort of throwing, pasta at the wall and see what fits, or what sticks. But there are some things that people do that, it's just time wasters, and it's sort of like busy work, and I didn't want to write, the things that you do that you think are helpful that aren't. I didn't want to write that in order to like make people feel even more confused, like, okay, well, I'm doing this and you say it's bad, so what do I do? It was more just to give you an idea of, okay, well, this is the type of thing, that you maybe shouldn't be doing because it's a time waster. And then I go into, a better thing to do would be this, and this is the reason why this is a time waster. And then the same thing with, things that you should be doing but probably aren't. One of the things in there I am pretty sure I listed was recording yourself. And it's one of those things. I know it's good for me. I know that it helps. I can hear the difference. And it's such an amazing preparation tool. But it's one of those things when I sit down to practice and it's time to record myself, I always come up with so many reasons why, I really need to get going today. I don't have time, I know what I sound like. I just sat here for, 4 hours, and then it's me looking in the mirror going, do you know how you sound? And so anyway, it's just all of these things that are very, very helpful, but either no one has presented them to you, or, you sort of have thought that it would be good, but you don't quite know why. It was just a way to help you in that way of being able to analyze yourself better, and become your own teacher.
Yeah, it's so important and so valuable. And I love that you have taken the time to put this together. What a massive topic. Practiceology is the course, and Lauren Pierce, you could follow her on Instagram. She's on the advisory board for the International Society of Bassists, so she's helping the international bass community. Be sure to check out her other courses on Discover Double Bass, and she loves to tackle tremendous topics and does it so gracefully, whether it's the right hand or left hand or solo playing or everything else you're doing. And we'll see more from you, but just thanks for chatting as always, and links to everything we talked about in the show notes. But again, discoverdouble.com will get you set up with that new course. Thank you so much, Lauren, for chatting. Great as always to talk with you. And folks, check out her course on Discover Double Bass. And while you're there, check out the other courses she's done and follow along with her on Instagram and everywhere else she's active on social media. Good stuff for sure. I just want to thank you so much for listening to this. It's a great topic, obviously, and it's so fun to talk with people like Lauren about these important topics that we're all thinking about all the time. Practicing, I mean, come on, I think about that every day. I'm sure you do as well. And I have so much fun, and I learn so much talking to people like Lauren. So if you enjoyed this and you're new to the podcast, I'd love it if you subscribed. You can subscribe all kinds of different ways. I'm not going to list them here. There's so many ways. ContrabassConversations.com/subscribe. I'll show you what to do and how to get these delivered to you automatically. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. If you're looking for a bass, Mitch is making beautiful instruments just east of Dallas, Texas, and learn more at mitchmooring.com. Thank you also to Krista Copper for going through and cataloging and archiving all the topics we talk about here. So helpful for building highlight episodes and all sorts of stuff like that. So thank you, Krista. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you each and every week from San Francisco, California, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.